no introduction. You've covered everything I have to say about that building. Joking. Okay, I've got a presentation which is in PDF, so it doesn't operate with us. I'll just have to pretend. Hopefully these guys will follow my cue, so bear with me. Right, first try. First slide. Okay. I'd like to start off with just a description of how we approach work. So for some time, most of us worked in other people's offices, including Zaha's, Wilkinson Eyre, Foster's, Rogers, etc., typically in London. So the people in our office come from those sort of backgrounds. So inevitably, especially if you move from one office to the other, most offices will tell you very quickly, that's not how we do it. We have a particular style, a house style, as it were. And if you do that often enough, you realize, well, I can pretty much do any style. Yeah. What's to discriminate one style from another apart from it's the house style? And practices get used to it. Clients get used to it. They'll deliberately go to that practice for a particular product, won't they? So we'll look at Zaha's or Gary, etc., and they're excellent at what they do. And they have a particular style, and clients will often say, I need that particular product, the same as you've done successfully elsewhere. The same success will come to me if I get exactly the same product. All those and many other motivations are there to, if you like, limit, as an architect, what you can do or might investigate in other areas you might investigate. So I'd like to start off with, so at some point we questioned exactly that. We all come from those different backgrounds. Are we going to generate our own house style eventually? How does that arrive at? And through those questions we were actually using, perhaps, I'm going to use Vasari, Giorgio Vasari, as an example of how we might better define style. So Giorgio Vasari, in the middle of the 1500s, 16th century, wrote effectively the first history of art and architecture book, not as formally as we recognize it today. He wrote a book called The Lives of the Most Excellent Artists, Architects and Sculptors. And because of that period, there was no formal structure to academic structure at that time, he included himself amongst these people. He was a painter and architect at the same time. Yeah, next slide. So yes, amongst the many people he included, he's there in the middle, amongst all the other ones that we now know as sort of Renaissance geniuses, if you like. However, the important thing is that the way he structured the book is biographies of each of those, and instead of giving a paramount, if you like, homogeneous style as a label to all of them, he singled each one out and spoke a bit of how they came to be as apprentices in a master's office, or studio, and in their own right, over some years, innovated, developed certain techniques, whether it's fresco, mixtures of paint, sculpture, etc., to become masters in their own right. So he's interested in each specific person and their biographies. Style is associated with an individual and a particular technique that they've mastered and continue to master throughout their lifetime. So each one might, he describes how each one might have developed early on a certain type of painting or sculpture, but it then went on to develop others. The important thing here is that a style is not homogeneous to one person, and that's their only style. It changes during their biography, but also it's not homogeneous across a whole period. And that's generally how we tend to understand it nowadays. If you talk to journalists or opinion makers, art historians, etc., for very good reason, because we need to rationalize, categorize. It's much easier to homogenize at the same time, and with inevitable outliers as a result. I think you can just roll through these. So those are the baptistry gates. So that was obviously a silversmith. So somebody who was trained as a silversmith who was invited to a competition. His training had already singled him out as being rather exceptional. So he wasn't interested just in the method of silversmithing, but he was also a reader, a humanist reader, what we call humanist. So he was outside the iconic, the tradition of icon making, reading humanism at the time, and therefore, if you like, taking lessons from the sculptures and of classicism, and bringing that back into his small works for churches and cathedrals of that time, and singling himself out as a result of going from the tradition into something that today we recognise as the classical tradition. And similarly with drawing, you can roll through these. Sculpture, so obviously this is the Renaissance period, this is Vasari singling these people out. And then obviously development of perspective, and then how those become manifest in bill forms. Yeah. So Vasari's book lasted as the definition of history of art, architecture, sculpture for about 200 years. He actually wrote, it was a bestseller, he wrote a second book. The second book slightly undermines my argument, but the second book, he had complaints that he hadn't included anybody outside Florence. So he began to include Venetians, and because he's Florentine, he became slightly prejudiced against the Venetians, and if you like, almost defined Venetian style to the Florentine. But the principal point is that he's identifying individuals and their processes. So the key thing here is process that derives a product. So 200 years later we have Johann Winkelmann, who is searching for particular classical sculptures. We were discussing this earlier today with some of your colleagues, and I think it was Antinius, for the cult of Antinius, the sculptures for them. And during that period, he effectively became the first archaeologist, because this was the period of the Enlightenment, so he's trying to be a bit more empirical about simply digging stones up, looking at them, throwing them back down. So he's properly mapping where he's digging, as it were, and reimagining how those might be re-erected. So his first book is the art of antiquity, so he includes Greek and Roman, and specifically their sculptures and architecture. If you roll through. Now, of course, what Winkelmann wasn't aware of, this is obviously, apart from the ruins, he's obviously coming across pretty much built, complete forms. But what he wasn't aware of, because is that all these were polychromatic. So his first book is pretty much an analysis. You could almost call it a proper academic study, the birth of archaeology and art history. The second book, he actually does label, he's careful to label it, title it as His Opinions. And now, that was far more important in the end, because his opinions, his personal opinion was a preference for Greek to Roman. Partly proportional, but mostly because he wanted to conflate the politics, what he felt were the more democratic politics of Greek compared to imperial, autocratic Rome. And he said the aesthetics are derived from a more democratic society. So remember, this is his opinion in the period of the Enlightenment, where the period of the Enlightenment was already beginning to slightly try to shirk off the autocratic rule of absolute monarchy. So the idea of those style being conflated with politics is something that was highly attractive to the environment. If you carry on. Obviously today we know most of what he thought was pure white bleached sculpture and architecture was actually polychromatic. So there's some errors in his thinking, but he describes how the purity of that white marble is as pure as the democratic difference between Greek and Roman. So you can see there's he's not a craftsman, he's not an architect, he's not a painter. He's a proto-archaeologist, in his second book, conflating his opinions with style. However, as a result of that, the book becomes a bestseller. It's, again, for the next, at least the next 200 years, dictating the idea that style is conflated with, if you like, a morality, a political morality. To carry on. The errors he makes, obviously, apart from not realizing that there's a polychrome to the work, to carry on, is that the stone is an abstraction of how buildings were made originally. So it's millennia of abstraction of original construction, as it were. While the people that Vasari is writing about are the people who are making, whether it's architecture or painting or sculpture, they are the makers, and they understand the processes of making. They even understand the processes of abstraction of the making. So they have the vocabulary and the ability to play with that knowledge. So if we carry on to the next slide. And of course, what happens is that during the 18th century, 19th century, the neoclassical period is born. It's very easy to mimic. You're effectively just mimicking drawings and their details from a pattern language. There's no sort of, if you like, innovation. So we don't get the Borrominis, Berninis, etc. during that period until another generation. I think you can again keep scrolling through the next slides because they pretty much tell the same story. Obviously, the idea of bleachedness and whiteness and purity transcends not just the neoclassical but also into the modern. So the lesson of all that is that whatever those materials are, it's the understanding of their structural, tactile, textural qualities. If it's a deep understanding that, as a craftsman, as an architect, you're able to not just use them, but you're able to dictate to structural engineers and others an understanding that helps to hopefully bring about a building that's made of those materials. So you're not directing ultimately just a facade that is a style of a particular period that you've adopted, that is then made behind, supported behind by the structural engineer, quantity surveyor, I'm sure you have them here, cost consultants, etc. And understanding of those materials allows you to do that, to understand from first principles how a building is put together. And therefore, the ultimate, the final result of that building is not an end product to forgetting the process result. So it's not having a drawing, a pattern book, from which you then allow somebody else to dictate how the structure is made. You are thinking from first principles, how is this building put together? And can the influence of those materials actually dictate the ultimate result? So yeah, we come up more close. Just roll through. So, has this got a laser on it? Shall I try? It's got a laser. No laser. No? No point in you putting it together. Okay, in the I'll just leave the microphone for a second.
Just up there. So that's the walled city of London.
Just on the north, outside the city walls, is where the cattle markets were, and fields with nothing on them. This is a map that was drawn in the Middle Ages. Our site is in those fields. Well, actually, if you go on to the next slide, it'll highlight the structure. So yeah, that was the recording of our site. And you can see there's an enclave. That's actually an Augustinian nunnery. That nunnery was built in the late 11th century, so around about 1090, by the Norman invaders. So if you know, the Normans were actually Vikings that spent their time going backwards and forwards across the North Sea, eventually settled in northern France, a group of them, and eventually, with the King of France, became formalised as part of their country as barons, principally to stop them taking over the rest of France. Now their skill was, amongst being good warriors, their skill was to they found quarries of limestone, and they realised by excavating that limestone while it was still soft, it was easy to carve, make quite strong interlocking block fortifications, and so this is around about 800, so for about 200 years until they invaded England. They effectively invaded land, made strong fortifications to keep that land, and carried on invading parts of France until they made this deal with the king. At the same time, at that deal, they agreed not to be pagan anymore. They became Christian, and not long after, they fell out with their associate, if you like, who promised them the throne of England, took it for himself, and they invaded England. And in that process, they got rid of the entire English aristocracy, what he called the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, and replaced it with their own barons. So it was classic invasion. Language changed to French amongst the aristocracy. And every baron who took the land had to take it forcefully. And because they'd become Christian, they all knew that ultimately they're going to go to hell for the amount of killing they had to do. But at that period, you could buy yourself out of hell by essentially building a monastery, or having an abbey, an abbess or abbot sign a certificate if you gave part of your wealth. So if instead of giving half your wealth, you might actually build a monastery. Baron Jordan Brissett built a monastery here. He put his wife in as the chief abbess, and used limestone to build the original buildings. It was the first in this area, so it's quite unique to England. And the abbey flourished for 500 years. As you know, Henry VIII needed to get remarried, and for that he basically adopted the Protestant faith, became head of the church to be able to get married. In that process, he realised he had to dismantle the Catholic Church in England, which basically meant all the wealth of the Catholic Church could go to him, the state. The top left is one of the noblemen he sent there to dismantle the abbey. The nobleman took it as his private palace. Unfortunately, his children fell out with the next monarchs and were beheaded, and the family exiled out of London, and the land taken by the state, by the monarchy. The next person you see is Oliver Cromwell. So he dismantled the monarchy at that time through a civil war, and became essentially dictator for life, because he didn't believe that democracy would work unless he was dictator for life. He built himself a big brick palace on the land, demolished what was left of the abbey and built himself a brick palace. When he died, the monarchy took it back. The monarchy was restored. They demolished his brick palace and slowly built some nice houses. But the city boomed, London boomed, and those houses were no longer for noble people, but became slums. And now the next two people you see are William Morris. So William Morris put a printing press on the same road that we're on, and he called it the 20th century press. This is the 1900s. And he had a writer for him called Karl Marx. And the picture of that building you see is William Morris's original printing press. It is now the Karl Marx Memorial Library. Lenin wrote, or used the printing presses to write his language paper there, Russian language paper there. And even to this day, the Labour Party in England will start its May Day march from that location. So our building is directly behind the one you can see with the crowd in front of it. If you go to the next slide. So that's a lot of history, a lot of interesting social history of change, dramatic change to the country with the Norman invasion, Henry VIII, Oliver Cromwell, slum clearances, etc. So we wondered, where on earth are we going to start with this? Let's be slightly literal. We'll be on a site that is actually occupied by timber structures, not stone structures, because we're not on the formal abbey buildings, but they're stables, etc. So why not allude to the external skeleton like a timber frame, except it was a bronze finish skeleton. This was very much liked by some of the planning officers, but absolutely not by some of the conservation officers who felt that brick or stone should be the predominant material. We're not very proud about what material we use. We thought we'd take the challenge. Now, as most of you know, stone is built, most stone buildings are built using this technology. This is, there's a superstructure behind, in that detail, concrete in this case, insulation with a vapor barrier, a gap, and the stone is cladding as a rain screen. Quite complex, and I've seen people build it in London. There'll be a team of 4 people working on one column for 1 week to actually finish it off. Seems, I mean, we all accept it, it's conventional wisdom, this is the way you build today. As architects, as I described earlier, we're asking ourselves, where on earth are we coming from, how do we start? Our interest is in building in materials that can do the same job as holding up the building as what you see ultimately. Not every project has to follow that rule, but as close as possible. Stone. So we asked ourselves the question, well, does stone have to be used like this? Is there no alternative? Can we not build as it was used traditionally? If you go to the next slide. Yeah, so we were working on a private house project with French stonemasons. So in England, our stonemasons are only educated to work for decoration. They're not educated to use stone for structural purposes. So we had to use French stonemasons for a structural staircase. So one of these old staircases that looks like it's being held up by air, but it's actually an engineering technology that was only rediscovered in England in the late 20th century. It's a sort of reciprocal, part cantilevered, part reciprocal structural flow. In this case it was travertine. So that staircase effectively holds itself up from one landing to the other and is only keyed in at one point in the wall. So we asked those French stonemasons, we've got a building to do now, not just a staircase. Is that possible? They said, of course it's possible. In France after the war, there was a French architect, Fernand Poulon, who demonstrated to the French government that it was cheaper and quicker to build in stone than it was in concrete or steel. Now, it wasn't the fashion after the war to build in stone because concrete and steel frames were part of that progressive tradition, if you like. So his lessons were pretty much ignored ultimately. However, we thought, let's see if it's still possible. So the important lesson here of the French stonemasons are telling us is, you see this staircase looks like, well, there are no columns holding it up, it's complete stone, there's no internal steel structure, this is not clad in any way. So it's all stone that sits against the wall and takes mutual rest from another piece of stone. The important thing here is, since the Middle Ages, they've been teaching in France the idea of what's called stereotomy. And that's the method that stone is cut to be able to rest its load on the next stone and the next stone and the next stone. So it's not about just drawing stone and understanding how you do the perspective of stone, but it's understanding that if I use this particular type of stone and I need to span this distance, how do I cut the stone to take the load path to where it should go? Go on to the next slide. Our first trip then was to a quarry, because as architects we'd never used stone for structural purposes. We asked if we could go and visit the quarry to investigate what the stone looks like, its texture, its colour. If you go on to the next slide. Yeah. And what we found was that onto the next slide as well. What we found is that stone is actually now, our stonemasons tell us, has become much cheaper to extract in the last 15 or so years because industrial diamonds have become incredibly much cheaper. So what's going on here is vertical cuts are being made using a cable with industrial diamonds on it. And occasionally you still have to use some hand tooling where it hasn't broken across its sedimentary layer. Go to the next slide. So principally in the quarry there are three types of finishes that result simply from extracting the stone. One is the saw cut of this cable with the industrial diamonds. The other one is either machine or hand drilling to subdivide the large blocks into the master blocks, the smaller master blocks that go onto the back of the trucks to the stonemason's yard. And then another layer is the natural sedimentary layer. Go on to the next slide. In that sedimentary layer you'll have, because it's a sedimentary stone, you'll occasionally get fossils, ammonite shells and quartz crystals. This is a sample we had made of how a column, two beams and another column fit together, and behind which a metal boss is then simply grouted. So you put it in place with mortar to keep it in place, and nothing else. Now, you'll notice the stone there is cleanly cut. And that's because the quarry master and the stonemason thought, well, as architects, you always want, all architects want clean cut stone, and then if you want something added to it, the stonemason will carve it in. And the stonemason told us, I can give you natural. We said, well, why do you want to give us natural? Well, because all the stone gets delivered to me like this. We asked, well, what about all the fossils in the quarry, and the natural sedimentary layer, the ammonite shells, the coral, etc. And he said, well, actually, that normally gets crushed as aggregate and then used as road aggregate before it gets tarmacked over. And we said, well, it's completely perverse that you're crushing, getting rid of this, and then carving in artificially a pseudo-natural finish. Can we keep the natural finish? So the decisions went in three steps. The first one is, can we build in stones? Is it economically viable to build in stone? The stonemasons came back with a price, which is, our previous speaker was explaining, turned out to be 25%, so a quarter of the price, if we'd built our building out of steel or concrete, and then did that cladding that I showed you earlier, that cladding with the insulation, etc. Well, we had to have our poker faces on because we thought, well, this is crazy. Even if he doubles the price, it'll still be half the price of the other one. The next decision is, engineering-wise, will it stand up? Now, we're not in a seismic area in the UK, but we have to deal with what's called progressive collapse. So if you take one column away, will the other columns drop after it? The way to deal with that is to oversize your columns. So to make sure that no vehicle, no internal gas explosion can ever remove that stone. So you either oversize the columns, or you reinforce the edge of your slab to be able to deform without collapsing, with enough time to then prop before you get a new column in. The next decision is, how do you finish that stone? Well, as I described, the answer became pretty easy. Why not just leave the natural material as it is? In Japan, for the last 700 years, they've celebrated the idea that whether it's stone or timber or any other material, the making or even of clay, the errors in that, the naturalness of that has a spirit, why not celebrate it? And in the UK, it was harder to persuade people that natural is actually got some beauty in it. It's not shockingly ugly, which is the initial reaction, I think, when you present people fossils as a finish. Go on to the next slide. So this is the detail. So we're interested in keeping those details as simple as possible. What you can see some concrete there, which is the floor slab. Above that is insulation, and the finish on this building, they wanted polished concrete as a floor slab, not timber or tiles, ceramic tiles. We actually are building another structure exactly the same, but now using timber as a floor slab instead of concrete, cross-laminated timber. But you can see there, the stone has got a pocket cut into it, in which one metal boss sits. The other metal boss is already pre-cast into the concrete, and then between them you bolt it together, and you have a solid nylon bar, which is the thermal break from between the inside and the outside. And then a standard inexpensive curtain wall that runs down the entire facade. Go to the next slide. So that's the floor slabs on temporary props, like any normal concrete structure, but there's no columns there, no concrete columns. So you keep the temporary props there in position, and it takes one day to put one row of columns and one row of beams. So the next day is reasonably fast, much faster than putting all those cladding panels on. Yeah. So you can see that they're simply lifted into place, and then the metal bosses put in. You can see in that slide on the bottom left-hand corner one of the cuts in the back of the beam where the metal boss will go in. You go to the next slide. So that's slowly, day by day, the structure. That's at ground level, so we actually have two buildings next to us, which are lower than us, but so at ground level, the exoskeleton, as it were, creates a colonnade on one side, and then the facade on the main street. So that's a typical upper floor. So as the building gets higher and higher, the size of the stones diminish depending on the load requirement set out by the engineer. That's the final rendering of it, drawing of it. And that's it in its context. So the context that we're in, I talked about the William Morris library, and also about a great deal of demolition. So what you're actually looking at, everything else, is all 1970s and 1980s. Because there was a bit of a crisis immediately after the war. Everybody wanted to build concrete frames and modern buildings. And in this area, there was a little bit left, and we were about to demolish the church and what was left as archaeological grounds of the old abbey, when in the 70s there was suddenly a movement for conservation, and the immediate reaction was, okay, we're conserving the archaeological grounds, we're not going to demolish the church, but what do we build around this area? Well, fake, pretend Georgian, pretend buildings. So all these are actually steel frames with half a brick thick facades that are pretending to be Georgian, Victorian. And clearly that's not the challenge the challenge that we wanted to avoid, as it were. If you go on to the next. If you look carefully, some of those beams and columns change in size, and that's how I describe the load path across the facade changing. Now, slightly counterintuitively, at the top they get bigger, and that's because there's no mass at the top to stop the wind from blowing the stone, so they have to get a little bit bigger to keep themselves in position with wind loading. But ultimately, from one master block, so one of those blocks I showed you in the quarry, you might initially, for the lower beams and columns, you might get maximum six of those. So if you divide that master block in 6, you know that you'll get a sedimentary layer, a drilled layer, and 2 saw cuts potentially. As you go up the building, you suddenly get more saw cuts because you can get more stones out of because they're smaller, out of the same master block. So you know that the finishes you're going to get are going to vary with 3 types, but do you leave that decision completely to random, or do you control it in some way? Well, we had to control it because if you don't, you accidentally get symbols appearing on the facade that you don't necessarily want to from the trabeated structure. So it's controlled, but it does look slightly random. And that's directly opposite this is actually an 18th century church that sits on top of the old chapel of St. Mary of the Abbey. Go to the next slide. And then we spent some time with English stonemasons, young stonemasons, to brought the French ones in to explain to them that stonemasonry is not just about decoration. We invited them on site just to help with their decorative skills, but also to teach them about structural. And the choice of decoration there is a mixture of typically English medieval, Gothic, what we later call the Gothic period, and then an Ionic capital at one end as well. Next, with the occasional symbols there. Now, today I learned that St. John or St. James was a basilica near Ephesus. Was that St. John? Not St. James. Okay. So the church opposite us is called St. James. Now the relic of St. James is actually in Spain, isn't it? In Santiago de Compostela. And when you do your pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, you carry with you the scallop shell as a tradition. And tradition is unknown. And as our guide who took us around the Ephesus Museum, Aveen, who I think is at the back there, told us there's nice continuity. People need to keep continuity through not just generations, but through cultural changes. And it never occurred to me, why on earth is everybody carrying seashells? What's the seashell symbol? Well, there's archaeological digs in Santiago de Compostela which have discovered that actually there was a temple to Venus, and Venus is brought from the foaming sea and sits on, as we see in the Botticelli, on the seashell. And they found scallop shells within this, around this temple, because there were pilgrimages originally to the temple. And as part of your pilgrimage, at the end of your pilgrimage, you deposit a seashell for a blessing for your fruitful year. So there are details at ground level of this building, which are not just carved into the stone, but they sit on these gates, that tell the story of how the structure, the stone structure that you're looking at is actually it's practically Neolithic, isn't it? It's a trabeated structure, column and beam. Not very complicated. However, most people that look at it and talk to us think it's highly contemporary, but it's highly traditional. It's contemporary in the sense that, yes, we've extracted the stone, left a natural finish, and used a solid nylon bar as a thermal isolation to then support what's contemporary structure within. But otherwise, the tradition is that we tend to build on the knowledge of our forebearers. So that story is told in the small carved and cast details on the ground level, including this. Next slide. These are interiors of the office, which is on the ground and ground floor. And these are the interiors of the apartment. So completely clean floor plates, where you can remove all the cabinetry that you see. If somebody new comes in there, they want it laid out differently, you can remove it all, because actually there's no internal columns, because the columns are the external skeleton. The only other structure internally is the lift and stair column. And that gives you the expression of those enfilade doors between the rooms, so you can get clear access when nobody's there. The cost savings allowed the client then to spend money on marble bathtubs. So where they saved on the overall superstructure, they spent the money on marble bathtubs and showers, solid marble. So the conclusion, I think, for us was that there's a long tradition of not just building in stone, but actually finding, if you ask the questions, because no one, we found out from our structural engineer and our cost consultant, in England, no one's built in load-bearing stone like that for about 90 years. They said, as a result, there is no knowledge. So there's a conventional wisdom that it's too expensive. The engineering won't work. So finding out that it's actually a quarter of the price, and actually 90% less of a carbon footprint than steel or concrete was, a revelation to us. What was the other revelation was there's a tradition in stone called stereotomy, as I was describing earlier, which if you train, and that's unfortunately the separation is that as architects now, we are not stonemasons, we're not Masonic, we're entirely separated from the stonemasons. While the stonemasons still have that knowledge, as architects we used to have that knowledge. We understood that if you wanted to put a door like that in that corner with an arch, there's a way of cutting the stone to allow the stone to be the superstructure as well as the finish. And doing that today is entirely impossible. Most of us today might draw it, an engineer would put a steel structure behind that, and then a cladding specialist would work out how that cladding is suspended, and so ultimately this is highly likely to be cheaper, quicker than the other conventional method. Now, in England, so France, northern France, especially in England, the Gothic period pretty much resulted as information and knowledge coming back from the Middle East. So their crusades essentially going across Europe, the Mediterranean, into the Middle East, and bringing the knowledge of working not just with rounded arches, but pointed arches, and these sort of transitions from a dome to the corner points, yeah? Which eventually is adopted in the Middle Ages with stonemasons in England, and perfected and made quite magical, I would say, even by today's standards. So this is all through the knowledge of stereotomy. Until quite late into the 19th century, this is essentially a flat floor made entirely of stone blocks. So this is before they, today you'd make that out of reinforced concrete. I wouldn't suggest that we should do this today, necessarily all of office floors be made in this way, but it demonstrates how stone was able to do those things that we think are entirely possible and unique to concrete. And even today, I think one of our colleagues here is working with special software, CAD models, and sometimes when we teach, we think we've invented all sorts of new parametric ideas. And I'm always shocked to find them during the Middle Ages, they already had the idea of using one element that, through the stereotomy principle of understanding through perspective how you can cut those stones, was doing what we might be doing today. But that software allows us the next step in that progress. And again, one of our speakers just touched on that. So here is that software working as engineer, architect and stonemason, telling you precisely how to cut that stone and where the load path results, how many stones to cut, etc., and how they interlock. Some built examples here. If you look carefully, that's actually just one piece of stone resting against another to form that dome. So it's cut precisely the same, so there's no variation in it at all. But then assembled to create that pattern. So that's a contemporary structure, actually, today's structure. And here to create not just a dome, but a flowing arch. So the opportunities, I think, are I don't want to say endless, but they're an advantage to us in a number of ways. Costs as well as carbon footprint, and potentially quite exciting as an architectural result. I've got a feeling that's the conclusion. Is there another slide? That's it, yeah. Thank you for that.
First of all, we would like to thank you for your presentation, and we would like you to present with this certificate.
Thank you very much.
Officially, you have to.
Thank you.
We thank you for being here. I just want to open the floor for questions. Does anybody has any questions for our guest? Well, yes, please, Constance.
Well, thank you for the amazing presentation. First up, should be heard. Thank you, Amin, for the amazing presentation and the very kind of interesting way that you showed how stone can be used in contemporary architecture, getting rid of all this common practice of cladding, actually. There is clear and amazing contrast between the interior spaces of 15 Clerkenwell Close and the exterior. I mean, a polished interior, sheer surfaces, even the stone parts are polished, very clear cuts. The detailing is of amazingly high standards, and an exterior which is kind of more brute, they say, in appearance. Not, of course, not left to chance or non-design, but there is a sort of this impression of a random part of design which is left to the natural state of stone, which of course bears in mind other examples that were shown in the introduction, for instance, Ensemble Studio in Spain, etc. And I was wondering, I mean, despite your very thorough analysis, you know, the historical account that you gave us, do you have a preference for the primitive? And I mean that not as a derogatory term, but in the way that Ernst Gombrich argued about the preference for the primitive as a way to argue about modern architecture, trying to forget for a second all the historical tradition and go back to some primitive references where he found some values in it.
There tends to be, I think each project will have its own ideas, a number of ideas. Ultimately, the DNA, the principal DNA in all our projects is this idea that whatever materials we choose should have a number of purposes. So there's some domestic projects where the most inexpensive way of building is actually to have the superstructure hidden by insulation. So the thermal envelope is on the outside. So in those projects, for instance, they might be timber structure. But if the timber can be allowed in that brutal way to be revealed on the inside, then we do. So their apartment buildings, what they call affordable housing, are just pure timber walls and ceilings and floors exposed because it is the superstructure of the building. Cladding those on the inside, again, traditionally we would, in the UK, we would call it cladding, but actually it's called plasterboarding. So we then put layers of battens with 2 layers of plasterboard, plaster, and paint. We realised that our client wanted to remove cost, and we said, well, why not remove that? That's again 20% of the overall construction cost. And what's wrong with looking at timber? Timber has a life. It's much more, apart from being sustainable, in the long term, much more sustainable in the sense that if you knock it, you knock your suitcase or you fall against it, the scratches you put on there, you don't have to fill in with plasterboard, sand, and repaint. They become part of the patina of the life of the timber in that domestic space. So depending on the project, the answer is yes. Sometimes, because of the DNA of that project, yes, we want those materials expressed. And the simpler, less, if you like, sophisticated in its processing of making it on site, so let's say in situ concrete, we've done plenty of in situ concrete private houses where clients want absolute purity in the concrete. And you show them a piece of marble and say, look, I could give you this instead, with all its internal grains, but they want concrete, but they somehow imagine concrete is almost like a paint. You know, it has to come out perfectly as well. And you explain to them that concrete also has a life, depending how you cast it, but they still want perfection. So we've managed to persuade slowly that even concrete doesn't have to be perfect. There's a brute in that, obviously, as well, without hammering it, chiseling it. etc. Literal sense of brutalism. But others, they become more sophisticated. So yes, the DNA in those projects is there, but other projects, sometimes there's a bunch of ideas orbiting your mind, and slowly, for one reason or another, they coalesce to more express a temperateness. So there might be a really refined brass, perforated brass screen suspended off the, so really expressing the sense iron cladding off the superstructure. But clearly that's not primitive, it's refined and expressing that sense of being sophisticated. Does that answer?
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Then I will just ask one, and I don't want to keep anybody longer. And in fact, I'm going to follow on Kostandy's question, but in a sense, maybe in a different sense. Meaning that, first of all, I didn't necessarily read at the vision of the primitive per se, but imperfect on purpose. So not imperfect is in the sense of primitive, but imperfect in the sense of life itself. And meaning that it's telling a story, as I mentioned in my introduction, and as it narrates it, it tells the story. It's not like a human being today is so conditioned with our appearances. This one is not afraid to show what it is, where it is coming from, what it's dealing with, how it was formed, and also with all these references to the context and everything, but proud of being who it is, not needing any plastic operation to look perfectly imperfect. But again, in the interior, it's so sleek, it's so perfectly finished that it made me think that maybe there's a separation, even though, yes, that facade is load-bearing and it's carrying the life in the interior, but facade is for the public, for the place it sits in, whereas the life itself is perfect with the reminder of the life outside.
Yeah, okay, so I sort of didn't answer that part of the question, but you're right to pick up on that. Let me answer that first, and then because there's two questions in that, really. So the domestic floors internally, if you look at them carefully, they're just, it's effectively a concrete slab that you're looking at, and you probably can't pick it up in the photographs, but they're very rough. You can see the aggregate in that slab. The floor is just polished because obviously you can't quite walk on the aggregate, so you have to polish that a bit, and that's really all there is, going back into the structure, back to the stair core. That's your inhabited space. If you look through the windows, some of those columns, you can see the rough through the window of columns and beams. When you then inhabit the space, we decided that we'd inhabit it with furniture items. So those furniture items are bookcases, wardrobes for your clothing, and then bathrooms which are like large pieces of cabinetry. All of those are oak with full-height doors, and then the interiors are oak lined. So it's cabinetry that's specially made, as it were. So it's like buying a wardrobe and bringing it into your house. So it's a refined piece of craftsmanship. You leave that to the craftsman. You don't necessarily dictate to them, saying, I need it to be artificially brutal in its appearance, rougher. So we left that to them as pieces of cabinetry that come in. The idea of those, of the sliding and pivoting full-height pieces in the cabinetry is that when it's all closed and looks like a box, it's effectively an open plan, free-form plan. You can do what you like, run around them. When you have guests and you want to shut them off, all those doors come into position and they define the space that's on the other side of that cabinetry. Ultimately, the idea is that you can remove all of those and just have one big open plan space that one day might become an office. So it gives you that flexibility. So it's defined by currently the domestic requirements, and it might be defined some other way in the future. But ultimately, really, it's just a utility. A floor acts as utility ready for occupation. And the occupation is defined by those people who whatever they practice within it. Now, there's the other question is not beautifying, not processing. So, in Japan, for 1,000 years, they were happy in refining more and more, especially during a period when they decided they didn't want any more, any influence from the outside world at all, because they felt that was threatening, and actually banned foreigners, and they banned foreign travel. They perfected internally their rituals, and that's part of the reason we admire the culture so much, because it's so perfect in places and so ritualized. But it became frustrating at one point for them, and they realized even the flaw in when you turn a pot, so there's a famous apocryphal tale of the potter, one of the empress potters, coming back after a break and finding that he'd left a thumbprint in the pot by mistake instead of rubbing it, and it was too late. But he left it in there because he realized that it's a sign of humanity in what has become a perfectly abstracted form. With that then came also, why don't we leave, instead of perfectly refined beams inside the buildings, why don't we bring a piece of timber as it is and use it as a beam? So every day we can look at it and be reminded actually where it comes from. It comes from the tree, it has the spirit of nature, and literally eventually in their deities, if you like, the spirit is actually in the material itself. So ultimately in the wood, in the stone, and other materials. So they found an acceptance of frailty, human frailty in the making of things, but also in the beauty of the frailty, the imperfect in nature. I guess that might take us some time to recognise, or if we recognise it, to adopt culturally.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, please.
I'm so sorry, I'm so late, but I'm dying to pose a question.
Okay.
I spent 5 years doing my doctoral studies in London, and Londoners are conservative. So, is this building, is it welcome? What about the reaction of the neighborhood? I'm really curious about that.
Well, you don't have to ask too much. You can Google it. And, so the planning process. Basically, there's a group of neighbours who are about 10 in total who hate it. But unfortunately, even 10 can have influence. Especially with fake news and all the rest of it. You can imagine today, it's very easy for a website forum to be established and then email the entire neighbourhood who are already connected with other forums, and before you know it, I'm not only being sent copies of emails, but actually leaflets, printed leaflets from a neighbour who says, "Have you seen this?" What does it say? They called it Aleppo House. Yeah? Aleppo House because apparently it looked like a...
It's been into the war zone.
War zone, yeah, exactly. Built by a recent Syrian immigrant who paid a bribe to the planner to build this, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? And I thought, this is rubbish. Just, ignore it. Bizarre thing is, I'm not a politician, I don't understand political science at all. Well, people believe it, don't they? Despite the fact they know who the hell I am. They're thinking, oh, somebody else must have built it, and me just happens to live there. This mysterious, recent arrival, Syrian recent arrival. And so slowly but surely, the rumour builds up that it must have been done by some corrupt means by this crazy Syrian guy. And people are beginning to sign a piece of paper saying, we must do something about it. And then one day, I have an officer from the local authority meeting me on site, wants to meet me on site, saying, this is built illegally. It's just completely getting out of hand. And the leaflets are saying it's all illegal. And what's happened is that I can't work out whether it was, if I was paranoid, I would think somebody took all the papers, documentation, and hid it. I think the innocent explanation is our planning officer that we dealt with, he retired. And now in the UK what happens is that any paper documents have to be scanned and uploaded, and then the paper is just got rid of. So when he retired, he was not somebody, he was old, he wasn't somebody who uploaded it himself. And when somebody took his desk, I think what happened is they just got rid of all the paperwork, sent it away. So there's literally not a single shred of paper or evidence that we ever even submitted any drawings, had any correspondence, etc., etc. Fortunately, we have it all there. But of course, I, not understanding political science, allowed this thing to go on for about a year and a half before I finally got a letter from the planning department saying, no, there's no evidence. Please demolish it. Okay, fine. I better get all the evidence myself, give it to a solicitor, send it to the planning department. Before I even had a chance to do that, one of the local politicians thought, well, the elections are coming. I'll take this up as a cause to show that I'm, on the side of right, and went to the local press and said, yes, this is entirely crazy, illegal, concrete monstrosity by this crazy person who's arrived in the country, blah, blah, blah. And then a day later, the planning department told him, whoops, we did give him permission for this. So now the politician is trying to save face, and it's not quite all over, but yeah, so there's the answer to your question. That one or two people who didn't like it started a rumour before you know it. Thankfully, it's only 10 now. And as a result, we've got lots of people who come out in opposition to that by the thousands, thankfully. But still, it's an important lesson. Make sure you look after the documents, and they do. And then if any rumours like that start, get rid of that fake news straight away. Don't allow it to sit there for a year and a half. Does that answer it?
Yeah,
Sort of.
I think it does.
Otherwise, most people like it. I think.
Well, thank you very much. And maybe if there is a question, last one, is there? No? Okay. Again, thank you very much, Amin, and thank you very much for being here.